Hey there, MMA fans! Get ready for some action-packed stories about fighters in the UFC. We'll talk about their ups, downs, and how they face tough challenges in the octagon. From CM Punk's bold move to Mickey Gall's jiu-jitsu skills, and even some legends like Royce Gracie and James Toney, these tales will show you that in MMA, it's not always about winning, it's about the heart and determination to keep on fighting.
He's been training with Kung Lee, and you saw in his corner. Oh! It is all over! Wow!
So, let's dive into these exciting stories together. Dave Herman. Dave Herman came into the UFC, which is a big fighting league with a really good record of winning 21 fights and only losing 2. He started off strong, winning his first UFC fight against a guy named John Olav Einemo. Everyone was like, wow, this guy might be a big deal in the heavyweight division, which is for the really big fighters. But things didn't go as planned for Dave. In his next fight, he lost to Stefan Struve. Then, he got knocked out by Roy Nelson at UFC 146. It seemed like every time he stepped into the ring, things just weren't going his way. He kept trying though. He fought Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, but lost that fight too. After that, he faced Gabriel Gonzaga, but again, things didn't work out, and he was knocked out in the first round. That's like being in a race and tripping right at the start. After losing 4 times in a row, the UFC said they couldn't keep him in the league. It's tough because being a fighter means you sometimes win, and sometimes you lose. Dave Herman had some great moments, but in the end, he had to leave the UFC. It just shows how hard the sport can be and how quickly things can change for fighters. Gilbert Yvel. Gilbert Yvel, a fighter in the UFC, came into the league with a really impressive record. He had won 36 fights, lost 16, had 1 draw and 1 fight that didn't count. No contest. Before joining UFC, he was known for not always being the nicest guy in the ring and for fighting really aggressively. He had a lot of wins where he beat his opponents in a really intense way. People thought Gilbert was going to do amazing things in the UFC because of his record and his tough way of fighting, but things didn't go as expected for him in the UFC. In his very first fight, he faced Junior Dos Santos, a really tough opponent, and lost by TKO, which means the referee stopped the fight in the first round at UFC 108. That's like losing a race right after it starts. Then he fought Ben Rothwell and lost that fight too. After that, he faced John Madsen, and again, things didn't work out. He lost by TKO in the first round. So after 3 losses in a row, it was a tough time for Gilbert. It just shows that even if you're really good before joining the UFC, things can be different once you're there. The UFC has some of the toughest fighters, and it's not easy to keep winning. Gilbert Yvel's story in the UFC shows how challenging the sport can be, even for fighters who have done really well before. Mustafa Al-Turk. Mustafa Al-Turk joined the UFC with a record of winning 6 fights and losing 3. He was pretty good at knocking out his opponents, which means he could win by making them unable to continue fighting. So when he started fighting in the UFC, people were watching to see how he would do. His first fight in the UFC was a big one. He faced Chike Congo at UFC 92, but it didn't go his way. He lost that fight by TKO, which means the referee stopped the fight because he was getting hit too much and couldn't defend himself properly. Mustafa's next fight was against a really famous fighter, Mirko Cro Cop, at UFC 99. This fight was also tough, and he lost again by TKO. It's like getting knocked down and not being able to get back up to keep fighting. Then, he fought John Madsen at UFC 112, but this time it went all the way to the end and the judges decided that Mustafa lost. That's called a unanimous decision, when all the judges agreed that the other fighter won. After these 3 losses in a row, the UFC decided it was time for Mustafa to leave, and he was no longer part of the UFC. It just shows that fighting in the UFC is super hard. Even if you're good at knocking people out, you can still face really tough challenges. Mustafa Al-Turk's time in the UFC was short, but it reminds us that in sports like this, winning isn't easy, and there's always a new challenge waiting. Dan Lauzon. Dan Lauzon, who is the younger brother of a famous fighter named Joe Lauzon, started his UFC career with 4 wins and no losses. That means he hadn't lost a single fight before joining the UFC, which is pretty impressive. When Dan got his chance in the UFC, his first fight was a big deal. He faced Spencer Fisher at UFC 64, but things didn't go as planned for Dan. He lost the fight by TKO, which means the referee stopped the fight because Dan was getting hit a lot and couldn't fight back properly. After this loss, the UFC decided to let him go, which means they didn't want him to fight in the UFC anymore. But Dan didn't give up. He worked really hard and won his next 5 fights outside of the UFC. That's a pretty awesome comeback. Because he did so well, the UFC gave him another chance and signed him again. In his big return to the UFC, Dan fought against Cole Miller at UFC 108. But this time, he lost the fight when Cole Miller used a special move called a modified Kimura to beat him. Then, at UFC 114, Dan fought Efrain Escudero and lost again. This time because all the judges thought Efrain was the better fighter. Sadly, after these two losses in a row, the UFC decided it was time for Dan to leave again. So he was cut from the UFC roster. Dan's story in the UFC had some ups and downs, and it shows us that fighting at this level is really tough. Even if you're good and you work hard, sometimes things just don't go your way. But it's also about never giving up and always trying your best, just like Dan did. Seth Petrozelli. Seth Petrozelli started his UFC career with a record of 7 wins and 2 losses. That means he had won 7 fights and only lost 2 before joining the UFC. His first UFC fight was against a guy named Matt Hamill. Seth gave it his all, but he didn't win. All the judges thought Matt was the better fighter, so Seth lost by what they call a unanimous decision at UFC Fight Night 6. After that loss, the UFC decided not to keep Seth around, so they let him go. But Seth didn't give up. He fought another fighter named Bernard Rutherford at a different event and won. This victory caught the UFC's attention again, and they decided to give him another chance. Back in the UFC, Seth fought Wilson Gouveia, but things didn't go well. Wilson defeated Seth with a move called a guillotine choke at UFC Fight Night 9. So, the UFC let Seth go again, but Seth was determined. He went on to win his next 4 fights outside the UFC, which is pretty great. The UFC noticed and signed him up for the 3rd time. Seth came back to fight Ricardo Romero at UFC 116, but he lost by submission, which means he had to give up because he was caught in a hold he couldn't escape. Then, at UFC 122, Seth fought Carlos Vermola and lost again, this time by TKO, which is when the referee stops the fight. After this, the UFC released Seth from his contract again. Seth's story in the UFC is about trying hard, facing tough challenges, and not always getting the results you hope for. But it's also about not giving up and always giving it your best shot, no matter what happens. Tiki Gosen. Tiki Gosen started his UFC journey with 3 wins, no losses, and 1 draw. That means he won 3 fights, didn't lose any, and 1 fight didn't have a winner. His first UFC fight didn't go as planned. He fought Bob Cook at UFC 24, but lost when Bob made him give up using a move called a rear naked choke. Tiki then lost another fight to Sean Shirk by submission at UFC 30, which is when you have to give up because you're caught in a hold. After these losses, the UFC said goodbye to Tiki, but Tiki didn't stop fighting. He won his next 3 fights outside the UFC. Impressed, the UFC gave him another chance. But again, luck wasn't on his side. Tiki lost to Robbie Lawler at UFC 40 and left the UFC once more. He still didn't give up. After winning 2 more fights, the UFC brought him back. But unfortunately, Tiki lost to Chris Little at UFC 47 by a bulldog choke, another kind of submission move. This loss led the UFC to let him go again. Tiki's story shows us that sometimes things don't work out even if you keep trying. But he also shows us that it's important to keep going and to never stop trying, no matter how hard it gets. Gabe Rudiger. Gabe Rudiger came into the UFC, a big fighting competition, with 10 wins and 2 losses. That's like winning 10 games and losing only 2 in a sport. He had his first UFC fight against Melvin Gillard at UFC 63. Unfortunately, Gabe lost that fight because Melvin was able to knock him out, and the UFC said he couldn't fight with them anymore. But Gabe didn't give up. He went and fought in other places and won several times, but also lost twice. The UFC saw this and thought, let's give Gabe another chance. So they let him come back to the UFC. His big comeback fight was against Joe Lauzon at UFC 118. But just like in a video game where you try again but still can't win, Gabe lost again. Joe made him give up using a special move called an armbar. Then Gabe fought Paul Taylor at UFC 126. Unfortunately, Gabe lost this fight too because Paul knocked him out. After this, the UFC said Gabe had to leave again. Gabe's story in the UFC shows that even if you're really good at something, sometimes it doesn't work out the way you want. But it's cool that he kept trying and didn't give up even when it was tough. Royce Gracie. Let me tell you about Gracie, a super skilled Brazilian jiu-jitsu champ. He had a record of 12 wins, 7 losses, 1 draw, and 1 fight that didn't count. One day he faced off against Matt Hughes, a UFC fighter, and totally dominated him. But guess what? Matt Hughes was Gracie's cousin, and Gracie wanted payback for something that happened at UFC 60. So they set up a match at HFC 112. Sadly, Gracie lost the fight in the 3rd round by TKO. It was a tough blow, and after that he kinda disappeared from the MMA scene. In simple words, Gracie, a jiu-jitsu pro, fought his cousin Matt Hughes in MMA, lost, and then vanished from the MMA world. That's the story, folks. CM Punk. CM Punk, a big shot in the wrestling world. He really wanted to try his luck in MMA, even though he had zero fighting experience. UFC gave him a chance and lined up his first ever MMA fight against Mickey Gong at FC 203. Now here's the thing, CM Punk was a total beginner in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like a brand new white belt, but he didn't give up. He trained hard for over a year to get ready for his big debut. In simple terms, CM Punk, a wrestling star, decided to give MMA a shot, even though he didn't know much about fighting. UFC gave him a chance and he trained for a year to fight Mickey Gong at FC 203. That's the story, folks. Mickey Gall. Mickey Gall had a fight at FC 82 against Mike Jackson and won. Mickey was pretty darn good at jiu-jitsu, like a high-level brown belt. So, when he fought CM Punk at FC 203, things got interesting. CM Punk, who was new to this MMA stuff, came in swinging for a knockout, but Mickey Gall quickly took him down and tapped him out with a rear naked choke in the first round. Ouch! Now let's switch gears to James Toney. This guy was a top-notch boxer with lots of titles. He thought he could just box his way to victory in the UFC. UFC's boss Dana White gave him a shot and matched him up with the champ, Randy Couture, at UFC 118. Randy Couture had other plans though. He took James Toney to the mat and basically dominated him, finally getting him with an arm triangle choke in the first round. After that, Toney disappeared from the UFC scene. In a nutshell, Mickey Gall beat CM Punk, who was new to MMA, and Randy Couture showed James Toney that boxing alone doesn't cut it in the UFC. That's how the cookie crumbled, folks. And there you have it, MMA fans. These stories remind us that in the UFC, it's not just about winning, but about facing challenges head-on. Whether it's CM Punk's MMA journey, Mickey Gall's jiu-jitsu skills, or legends like Royce Gracie and James Toney, they all teach us to never give up in the world of mixed martial arts. Keep cheering for your favorite fighters, and who knows what exciting tales the Octagon will bring next. Thanks for tuning in and stay pumped for more MMA action.